So in recontextualization always involves some filtering of the meaning potentials, as Blackledge said in the book. So this also raises question then, well, when we speak of news translation, is there a kind of transfer of what is actually transferred from one language to another? If you see, we have all these recontextualizations. So when news move along the whole chain from one newspaper to another, from one country to another, so we have quite a number of transformations. So in the case of an interview, for example, you have a transformations from the spoken to the written. So interview is conducted orally, it is interpreted, but then it's written up. So the transcripts you find is already not 100% exactly the oral what was orally said. So then we have the transformations which happen from one language into another. Then we have transformations which occur when we have the complete full text turned into an article, when we have the extractions, where we see omissions, restructuring, rearrangements, and also once the text, before the text gets published, it's checked by revisers or by other journalists. So there's another transformation going on to make the text suitable for the readership. And also sometimes you have transformations of the genre. So when you say originally it was an interview, but then you have a report about an interview. So it's no longer an interview. So all these transformations depend on the goals, the values, the interests of for whom do I produce my text. So the newspapers aims the readership, the country, the language, the bilateral relations between the political countries involved. So news translation is a relatively new topic in translation studies. So it started in the 2005-06. There was a research project in Britain, translation in Global News, and this book published then by Esperanza Bielsa and Susan Besnett was kind of summarizing the main findings. So what they said, what is characteristic of news translation is that it's managed through the journalistic practices of news production. So it's part of the journalist's work. So it's governed by the journalistic values, particularly speed. So text needs to be out. It's no longer news if you wait to polish it up. The translations are done in most cases by the journalists themselves. So they are multi or bilingual journalists or international journalists, as they're called. But sometimes also what the journalists then report is where they have interpreters involved, or if you go like the Middle East, when you have all the problems in Syria, for example, when journalists go there, so they don't necessarily speak the local language, so they get local people who help them find their way around. As fixers is a term which is often used for these local people who help the journalists. So, but also in news texts, you see there is evidence of some translation work must have been going on, but there is no explicit reference to translation. And also when you talk to the journalists, they say, oh, no, we are not translators. We are journalists. Yeah? So we know the language, we produce the text on the basis of another language, but that's journalistic work. So this work is fully involved in the journalistic writing process. And they also say, no, we are not translators. Because a translator would produce a text which is not really readable. We produce the text for our audience. So a perception of translation as this kind of literal word-for-word reproduction which would end up in stilted discourse then. So this also, say they do work which we as translation studies people would call translation, but the journalists themselves do not think of what they are doing as translation because they think translation is just the kind of the narrow reproduction process. Yeah. And also in research, so some people do not refer to this journalistic work as translation. Some people prefer to call it trans-editing, because you say it's not one source text, one target text, but there are all these transformations involved with adaptations, reorganization. So the text, you can't really compare a source text and a target text. But there is also diversity and complexity in the mass media. Not all newspapers have exactly the same practices. Ji-Hae Kang from Korea, she did some research which said there is a South Korean version of the US magazine Newsweek. So quite a large amount of the text get translated into Korean. And she looked particularly as texts where, from the US perspective, they had reported about North Korea and said, how do these texts in Korean for the South Korean readership, what do they look like? And then she discovered saying that the practice for this Korean version of Newsweek said they actually employ translators. So the texts are sent to translators who translate the text. Then there are what is called checkers who do a revision, so comparing the source text and the translations they have received from the translators. And then there are the so-called top checkers who then read the translated version to take the final decision of what additional changes or revisions may have to be made for political, ideological reasons or omissions then may happen when the top checker gets the text before they give their final okay for text to be published.